Thanks, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it very much. So, first thing I want to talk about is business ethics, and lots of things to be talked about. To fully cover that topic, I'm going to cover only one aspect of it. Basically, part of why it's hard to be a good person even if you want to be a good person. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our new department. So, a word of the day, humility. Always a good idea when you're thinking about business ethics, humility. Keep that in mind. Okay, so here's the second thing. I would like all of you to just for a second think about something you've done in your life that you're not particularly proud of, ethically speaking. If Jesus is in the crowd, he doesn't have to worry about this, but the rest of you, think a little bit about something you might have done that you kind of wish you hadn't. And so then, hoping you've done that, I'm now going to do something completely unrelated. I'm going to try something high-tech, which I don't normally do. I've got like a little movie in here. We're going to see if this works. Just takes a few seconds about something called the McGurk effect, which I imagine most of you have seen. I'm guessing some of you haven't. I showed it for the first time to my daughters many years ago, and they thought it was so cool, I tried to get them to do it for a science experiment in grade school. So, fellow's going to come on the screen. I want you to look at him very carefully and listen to what he has to say.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, that was articulate. One more time. Watch him very carefully.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, that was interesting. How many have seen that before? Oh, okay, I'm surprised. So, what did he say? You got no idea. What did he say?
Da, 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 da.
Da, 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 da. Okay, that's interesting. And you, what did you think he said, Charles? You got no idea? Elena, what does it sound like to you? Ga, 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 ga. Okay. It's kind of mixed up there. All right. Any others? I got so far a da, da. I got a da, da and a ga, ga. Anybody else hear anything else? The rest sounds just kind of mushy. Okay, actually. Okay, stay over here. Stay over here. I asked to do this without the mic, but I didn't win. So I'm going to do this one more time. Do me a favor. Click. Close your eyes and listen to it.
Ba, 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 ba.
What did he say? You still can't get it. Ba, 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 ba. It's clearly what he said. So part of the point of this, I guess in addition to humility being an important thing to keep in mind, the other thing to keep in mind is it's the brain, stupid. It's all about the brain. We think that we see with our eyes and we hear with our ears, but actually we do both with our brains. And when the brain gets conflicting signals, it makes stuff up. It essentially fools us, and this is called the McGurk effect. The guy was mouthing something else, but the sound that was coming across was ba, 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 ba. But we're all sort of unconscious lip readers. And so since his lips were saying something else, and his mouth was saying ba, ba, we got something completely different. Our mind just made it up. It's called the McGurk effect. If they have him say ga, 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 ga with his lips, and they play ba, 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 which is essentially what we did, you tend to get da and tha. If they play ga, 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 ga as the sound, but his lips go ba, 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 then we end up with kind of a combination. They're all kind of mushed together. That's something called the McGurk effect. And so to give you a little more detail, basically hearing and vision intersect, and I've talked about that. We might try to, but we can't. We end up putting both those together. And the basic point of all this is that our brains fool us. Our brains just make stuff up. So that's the message here. Our brains fool us, and our brains fool us in a whole bunch of different ways. Another example of this is something called split brain research. I just love the name, split brain research. Who wouldn't want to get into that? So lots of times, doctors split people's brains in two. We got the two hemispheres. We've got connecting tissue between them that facilitates communications going from one hemisphere of the brain to the other hemisphere. The connecting tissue is called the corpus callosum, and sometimes doctors go into your head and just slice right between the two and cut off all communication from the left side to the right side, which sounds like kind of a goofy thing to do, but as you might imagine, there's a good medical reason for it, and you might even guess what that reason is. It has to do with epilepsy. The fact that sometimes when a seizure starts in one part of the brain, it spreads to the other part of the brain, and if they can cut people's brains in two, it stops spreading back and forth, and they can cut epileptic seizures in a lot of people by 70% if they'll just cut their brains in half. So now that you've got people with split brains, of course, there are scientists around who say, oh, hey, we can study that. Let's get those people in a lab and figure out what the impact of having a split brain is. And it has shown, this research, again, in many ways, how our brains tend to fool us. And so, in a particular experiment, a scientist presented the word walk to only the right side of the brain. So the right side of the brain, that comes in through the left eye. So basically, they close the right eye, put the word walk up to get it into the right side of the brain. The patient sees that, and he gets up and he starts walking. Then they asked him, you just got up and you started walking. Why did you do that? Well, now the problem is that the explanatory part of the brain, the language part of the brain, is over here, and didn't see the walk part, didn't see the cue. But that part of the brain is the interpreter. It takes in everything that's happening and then tries to make sense out of it. And so the guy says, well, I wanted to go get a Coke. Not true. It's just what his brain told him. And near as he could tell, he believed it. They did another experiment where they typed in the word funny. And the guy starts laughing. And they asked him, why'd you start laughing? And he said, oh, you scientists, you're just so funny. Because he had to make sense of the circumstance. I can go on. These just fascinate me. I'll give you one more example. So they put a picture of a chicken. And let's see, it went in the right side to the left side of the brain, which is the language part. Put a picture of snow to the left eye that went into the right side of the brain. And then they put a bunch of pictures in front of the person and said, pick up a couple pictures. So with his right hand, left side of the brain, seeing the picture of the chicken, he picked up a picture of the chicken. With the left hand, with the snow, he picked up a picture of a snow shovel. And they asked him, why did you pick those two? Why did those go together? Well, again, his left side of the brain hadn't seen the snow, didn't know why, but made up a story. Well, chickens are messy, and so you need to clean up after them, and so you have to have a shovel. In a whole lot of different ways, our brains fool us, and we think we know what's going on, and we don't really know what's going on, in part because sometimes our brains are making us up. There's a symptom or a condition known as, I can't even pronounce that, anosognosia with hemiplegia, and the idea is you've had a stroke, and therefore one of your arms is paralyzed, for example. You also have had damage to the part of the brain that manages body integrity and position. And when people have that, they can't move their arm because of the stroke. But when you ask them, why don't you move your arm? They'll say, that's not my arm. And they really believe it's not their arm. Or sometimes they'll say, well, I just don't want to move it. Just don't choose to. Again, the point is, their brains fool them. Dr. Michael Gazzaniga, who is kind of the father of split brain research, says, anytime our left brain is confronted with information that does not jibe with our self-image, knowledge, or conceptual framework, our left hemisphere interpreter creates a belief to enable all incoming information to make sense and mesh with our ongoing ideas of ourselves. And so now I'm slowly starting to take this conversation toward business ethics. There are a lot of other things that fool us besides our brains. A variety of forces influence our ethical decision-making in ways we don't understand. I could talk really all afternoon about these, but I'm going to talk about a few of them here. See if this rings true with you. It does with me. In our heads, we constantly kind of have this little conversation going with ourselves about the kind of people we are. Maybe you don't do this, but I do this. I think about the kind of person I am. And the story I tell myself is I'm a good person. Grew up on a farm in Kansas. You know, my mom went to church and dragged me to church, and I learned all the right values and hard work and everything, and I teach business ethics for Petey's sakes. I must be a good person. And needless to say, I really, really want to believe that. So when my brain tells me that, I tend to go, yeah, that's me. On the other hand, there's evidence for most of us, I think, that at some point in our lives we've done some things that maybe we shouldn't have, that we weren't perfect like we would like to have been. We know that, but we still want to tell this positive story to ourselves, about ourselves. And so a study that just came out about a week ago, I found intriguing along these lines. Some scientists asked a bunch of people to think about things they'd done in their lives that were good, ethical things, and things they'd done in their lives that, you know, maybe they weren't so proud of, like I asked you earlier. And the interesting thing they found was that what people tend to do is they remember bad things from a long time ago, what they did in high school, what they did in college. They tend to remember good things that are much more recent. That allows them to tell themselves, oh, well, you know, I'm not perfect, of course, but I'm on an upward trajectory. I'm getting better and better. I'm doing the right thing. I really think I'm on the right path now. You can tell yourself a real positive story if your mind can take the bad stuff you did and put it way in the past and only, you know, dredge up the old things. And when you're thinking about the good stuff you've done, well, that's more recent. Another aspect of this, of the way your mind can fool you in ways you don't understand, is a concept called moral self-regulation. It's kind of like a teeter-totter. We all want to be good people. We want to do the right thing. We want to live lives we can be proud of. But, you know, we all kind of want the same stuff everybody else wants. We want money, and we want reputation, and we want respect, and we want sex, and we want lots of stuff. And sometimes, you know, those things conflict. That's where a lot of ethical conflicts arise, because those two things kind of run into each other. And so we're kind of constantly kind of balancing sort of back and forth. And there's a concept known as moral license, where under certain circumstances, we kind of give ourselves license to maybe play a little faster and looser than we would normally do. And so I want to talk about Dalian Kane. He's a professor at the Yale School of Management. I was at a conference with him about a month ago. He gave a presentation talking about a couple papers I'm about to talk about, and he actually started with the McGurk effect. And I thought, I've been showing that to my daughters for years. I've been trying to figure out a way to work it into a presentation. Finally, I've got one. I'm going to steal Dalian Kane's idea and do it, because it is all about the brain. So, stockbrokers, he decided to study. And the idea was, he set up two cohorts of stockbrokers. One group would give advice to their clients. And of course, stockbrokers don't owe a fiduciary duty to their clients. They are supposed to provide suitable recommendations for their clients. But if they have a range that are all suitable, they can pick the one that puts the most money in their pocket, as opposed to the one that is the best for the client. They're in kind of a constant conflict of interest situation with their clients. So he had one group of stockbrokers basically advising clients. He had another group of stockbrokers telling the clients, you know, I'm in this conflict of interest situation. You should know that sometimes, you know, it's in my best interest to not necessarily pick the best stock for you. You just need to be aware that that's a possibility. And then he looked at the recommendations those stockbrokers gave to their clients. And what he found out was, when they had done this great thing of disclosing to the clients, hey, I'm in this conflict of interest situation, they felt so good about themselves that when they made recommendations, they really screwed the clients. They gave them much worse stocks than the guys who hadn't disclosed. They'd done this good thing. They gave themselves moral license then to take a little bit of leeway with the clients. Another study that Daly and Kane and his colleagues did involved charities, did a couple things. One was he gave some people, let's say I split the room in half. I give this half an opportunity to help somebody out in some particular way. Maybe volunteer to help a student by filling out a survey at some later point. And then later, he gave everybody in the room an opportunity to donate to charity. And what he found was that the people who had done the good thing, oh, I volunteered to help these students out, gave themselves moral license to be really cheap with the charity. The people who hadn't helped somebody out and didn't have that in their minds were much more generous than the ones who had helped the charity out. They didn't give themselves moral license. In another iteration of the same experiment, he asked one half of the room to think about the bad things that they might have done recently, and the other side of the room to think about the good things they might have done recently. And then a little later on, he gave both the opportunity to donate to charity, and the people who had thought about the bad things that they had done gave much more generously than the people who thought about the good things they'd done, because they needed to get back up. They knew they needed to crawl back up, which is why I asked you to think about the bad things you'd done, just in case Dave is going to bring any development people in later to ask you for money for McCombs, because we're needing money and I want you in a generous frame of mind. But the important point about all of this is we don't realize this. We don't realize how our minds fool us. We don't realize how the last decision we make can affect this decision that we make. In an article I was reading, they said, ever notice how many times you'll have a Prius and an SUV in the same garage? It must be this notion of, I bought the Prius and so I'm being environmentally friendly, and so that gives me a little license to buy that really big SUV I've been wanting. What I think about is British Petroleum. As you may know, sometime around the turn of the century, they decided to rebrand themselves. They wanted to be the environmentally friendly oil company, energy company. Sustainable energy, BP, solar, et cetera, et cetera. Lord John Brown, big advocate of corporate social responsibility. I'd say he became the world's leading expert, the most visible authority on corporate social responsibility. You want to hear about corporate social responsibility? John Brown was the guy to have talk. I'm just speculating, but I do wonder if people at BP, thinking about what an environmentally friendly company we are, how we're leading the nation, leading the world in being corporate social responsible citizens, if at some point they didn't give themselves a little moral license to play fast and loose here and there, and that could be the outcome. Only speculation, but it would be consistent with what we know from the studies that Daly and Kane has been doing. And again, the key thing is we don't really realize this is happening to us. We really have to keep our antenna up to realize these forces are affecting us, or else they'll catch us unawares, I guess I should say. So let me talk about just a few other things. The self-serving bias is something that affects everybody. For example, if you're interested in the election and you've got a candidate in the governor's race that you're really interested in. Personally, I think we had two goobers who put the goober in gubernatorial, but let's say that you really like one of them but don't like the other one very much. And you're reading through the newspaper and you see if you're like me, you're heading for the sports page as fast as you can get there, but you're reading through the newspaper and you see a headline and you can tell from the headline that it's going to say good things about your guy. You may well stop and read it. But a couple pages later, you see a headline, you can tell it's going to say bad things about your guy. You're probably just going to go on. We all have a tendency just to deflect, to not seek out, to even avoid information that conflicts with our best interests or conflicts with the beliefs that we already have. That's the self-serving bias. We even process information differently. They did a study where they took a paper that had some arguments for the death penalty and arguments against the death penalty and put it in front of people, some who were for the death penalty, some who were against the death penalty. And they asked them, when they'd done reading, what do you think? People who were for the death penalty said, that's just what I'm saying. Death penalty, good idea, and started counting off the arguments in the paper that were for the death penalty. That's what came out of that paper, that's what they ended up processing. People against the death penalty, exactly the same, except opposite. That's just what I'm saying. All those reasons not to have the death penalty, this, and this, that's what they processed. They went back 6 months later and asked them what they remember from the article, and the people who were for the death penalty remembered the pro-death penalty arguments. The people who were against it remembered the anti-death penalty arguments. So when we are accessing information, processing information, even remembering information, it's significantly affected by something called the self-serving bias. I'm picking on Daly and Kane again, because he told me he had just done this study. He described it as very interesting. So this is a real case. In Ohio, a carpenter is remodeling this gal's house and finds $88,000 in old bills inside the house, inside a wall. And so, there are different legal rules from state to state, but as an ethical matter, who should get the money, the carpenter or the homeowner? How should they split it up? Well, after setting out the facts, Daly and Kane asked two different groups of people. With one, he said, imagine you're a homeowner and this happens to you. What would be a fair way to share the money? Another group of people, he asked, imagine you're this carpenter, you'll come across this money, and gives them the facts. What would be a fair way to share the money? In the great scheme of things, since you're only asking what would be fair, not what's in your best interest, you would think the numbers would come out the same, but instead, they came out quite different. People who just for 3 seconds imagined themselves as the homeowner thought the homeowner ought to get most of the money. People who just for 3 seconds imagined themselves as the carpenter, thought the carpenter should get the money, or most of the money. Similar study was done several years ago by a guy from Carnegie Mellon named George Lowenstein. He sets out a car accident with great detail about the accident happened, this occurred, and these were the damages, and blah, 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 and a lawsuit gets filed. And he's got a bunch of law students. And he tells them, imagine you represent the plaintiff. But that's not really important, because the key thing I want you to do is go through these facts and decide what would a fair settlement be, fair for both sides. But then a different group of law students, he asked them, imagine you represent the defendant. That's not really important, because the key thing is what's a fair settlement for both sides. And then a third group of law students, he just says, what's a fair settlement? Well, the group of law students just asked to produce a fair settlement, come up with a number, I don't remember the exact numbers, let's say $500,000. The people who think they represent the plaintiff for just 5 seconds, $600,000. People who think they represent the defendant for just 5 seconds, $400,000. These are all just experiments. This is all just hypothetical. But think about the impact that the self-serving bias has in the real world and how much it affects the judgments that we have and how sometimes things just seem completely right to us and a third party looking at it thinks, how could you be so unethical? How could you be so incredibly stupid? I do a little bit of merit evaluation in my role over in the business school, and one of the things that's clear when you're in committees, every faculty member is going to know this, when you've got a faculty member who's really good in research and not a very good teacher, and he gets you thinking about what needs to be rewarded around this school and what doesn't, well, by George, it's research and it's not teaching, and you flip it around, it's just the opposite. It's just like in baseball. The power hitters think that home runs should be rewarded. That's the key thing. The guys, little punch and Judy hitters, think average, fielding, not so much the home runs. We all have our point of view. Self-serving bias really affects all sorts of judgments that we make. And it can lead us to do things which other people think are unethical because they can tell how biased we are. We can't see it in ourselves. Our brains fool us. Let me talk quickly about overconfidence. It's coupled with the over-optimism bias, which I like too. We all tend to be overly optimistic about how things are going to work out for us. We read in the newspaper about people getting cancer, we don't think we're going to get cancer. We read in the newspaper about people dying in car wrecks, and we don't think we're going to be in a car wreck. And that's great. That's a great way to live your life. It's evolutionarily beneficial. I always ask my MBA students, they're 27, 28, 29, how many of you are married or just about to get married? And about half the hands will go up. Well, I'll ask you, how many of you are married or about to get married? Let's see those hands. Okay, how many are going to get divorced? Every hand goes down. Every hand goes down my MBA. So then I ask them, okay, How many marriages end in divorce? Well, about half. They know half the marriages end in divorce, but it's never going to be theirs. And as I say, it's evolutionarily beneficial to be overly optimistic. Psychologists say that the only people who are really well calibrated, who really have a good sense of what we're all up against every day, are the chronically depressed. They can't get out of bed, but the rest of us keep plunging ahead because we are irrationally overly optimistic. That gets coupled with the overconfidence bias. I'm going to get to the next slide in a second. Again, if I did a survey, and I do these from time to time with my students, it's quite common for 80-85% of people to say, I'm a better than average driver. 80-85% of people say, I'm a better than average auditor or plumber or whatever they happen to be. They did a study a few years ago. They asked college professors, are you better than average classroom teacher? 94% said yes. The other 6% really sucked, apparently. So that ties in with ethics in that 80% or so of Americans believe they are more ethical than other people, more ethical than their neighbors, their friends, their competitors. 92% of Americans are satisfied with their character because we're sitting around, we're telling ourselves these little stories about what good people we are and how we were raised on a farm and our mom went to church and so we must be good people because we teach business ethics. And if we become too convinced of that, we end up fooling ourselves and we end up making mistakes that we wouldn't otherwise make. Here I always think about the Enron people. I think down at Enron, one of the things that happened to them was they just got so full of themselves. They were the smartest guys in the room. Year after year named the world's most innovative, most admired company. They had the big Rice Code of Ethics. And when stuff started coming out about the scuzzy stuff that was going on down there, they couldn't believe it. The employees could not believe it. They would tell newspaper reporters, you got to be kidding. We're Enron. We got the Code of Ethics. This couldn't be us. They just couldn't believe it. And I think they got so confident about their own character that they made decisions that they didn't really reflect on carefully. And part of the point I want to make to you is we can all do that if we get to believing the stories we tell in our heads and we don't pay attention to the fact that we've got all these factors kind of working against us. If we're not careful about it, we can end up stepping in it just like the Enron people did. To show how strong a force this is, let me give you a couple of examples. Here's another study I love. Iteration number one of the study was they described an experiment to people. And they said, in this experiment, we're going to give folks an opportunity to cooperate in this setting, and we're going to give them an opportunity to donate to charity and be generous in this setting. Given what we just described here, how cooperative and how generous do you think people will be? And the people they tested guessed, and they did a very good job. They did really an excellent job of predicting how generous and how cooperative people would be in this experiment. Then they did a second iteration of the study. After describing it, they said, how cooperative and generous are other people going to be? And how cooperative and generous are you going to be? Well, a very high percentage of the people predicted that they would be more cooperative and more generous than the other people because they were good people. And they're telling these stories in their heads about what good people they are. And again, they did an excellent job of predicting how cooperative and how generous the other people would be. But when push came to shove and they had the opportunity to be cooperative and generous, they had overshot the mark substantially. They had been way too optimistic about how cooperative and generous they themselves would be, even though they pegged other people. Now, it's the third iteration that's the really interesting one. They bring them in, lay out the formula, and then tell them, you know, we did this once before. And people were subject to the overconfidence bias. They thought all this stuff doesn't apply to them, it just applies to other people. And so they predicted well how cooperative and generous other people would be, but they over-predicted how cooperative and generous they themselves would be. But of course, you tell me that, it doesn't apply to me, that's those other guys. And so once again, despite being warned, despite being inoculated, they made exactly the same mistake. Predicted well how cooperative and generous other people would be, over-predicted how cooperative and generous they themselves would be, even though they've been warned. So 92% of us, very pleased with our own characters. 80% of us know we're just more better people than other folks. And as I'm sitting here talking to you, I'm telling you that 10% of my brain knows that I'm not a better person than most of you, and 90% of my brain is saying, yes, you are, Prentice. All this stuff doesn't apply to you. It applies to those other people. It doesn't apply to you. You grew up on that farm. Remember that? You remember how hard you worked as a kid? Blah, 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 blah. We've got to work every day at being realistic about what we're up against when we want to be ethical people and try to be ethical people. Humility, an important word to keep in mind. Situational factors, I could go on and on forever. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Again, here's the really important thing. So you grew up on a farm in Kansas, you worked hard, your mom went to church, you got all the right values, blah, 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 blah. And so you think, okay, I'm a good person. I get in a situation where I've got to make a choice. I'm going to make the right choice. Good people make the right choice. I'm a good person. I'm going to make the right choice. That's kind of how you get overconfident, because you don't realize what an impact situational factors can have on you. If there's one result from all the psychological studies of the last 50 years that really is salient, it is that the situational tends to dominate the dispositional. Our disposition may be we want to be a good person, we want to do the right thing, but situational factors over and over and over again will swamp our inherent character. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. Good Samaritan study number 1. I love this study. We've got seminarians, and we give an assignment to talk to a group about being a good Samaritan. And then we release them from where they've been preparing their talk to go to the other side of campus where they're going to give the talk. And as they're walking across campus, they just happen to go past a guy who's lying by the side of the sidewalk, moaning, groaning, obviously in serious distress. Well, a pretty high percentage of those seminarians getting ready to go and talk about being a good Samaritan stop and help the guy out. Seems like a no-brainer, right? With another group of seminarians, we run exactly the same experiment, except we tell them they're 5 minutes late to give the talk. And then almost all of them go right past the guy. They see him, they look at him, they keep right on going. Just being a little bit late, not one to be late to the talk, they leave this guy in tremendous distress. That's how much the situation can affect the decisions that we make in ways that we don't even understand. Here's another one I like. One weekend, they put a gal out on the interstate, set her up with what looks to be a flat tire. She's there with a flat tire. They count the number of cars that drive by and the number of cars that stop to help her out. Woman in distress, needs help with the tire. It was a fairly low percentage, but some people helped out. That's good. The next weekend, they ran exactly the same experiment, put the gal out there, flat tire, except that 5 minutes up the road, they had somebody else with a flat tire and a guy who had stopped to be a good Samaritan and help her out. And now a whole bunch more people stopped to help this other gal out than had the weekend before, because good conduct had just been modeled for them. They just saw somebody doing the right thing, and that increased the chances they would do the right thing. Again, completely unconscious. They had no idea this was affecting their judgment, but it does. It's one of the reasons why in a corporation you want your top officers to be great guys and gals of character. Because if they'll do the right thing, if they'll model the right behavior, it'll flow right on through the organization. Just one more. We're constantly worried about cheating on exams at UT. Scientists love to run experiments like this. They can run little experiments where you take a test on a computer and then you self-report to the people running the experiment that you did well or you did poorly, and you get a money prize. And so by just keeping track of the computer, they can tell who's lying to them and who's not about how they did well. And so one of the things they found out is that by just telling somebody before they take the test, just reminding them of a Bible verse is all it takes for their cheating to go way down. That's all it takes. In another situation, they ran an experiment with an exam and cheating and that sort of thing. They put an honor code. Because these were students. They put an honor code, the school's honor code, there on the test, and had them sign the honor code. It took cheating down to 0 in that experiment, which is why I've got the honor code on the front page every one of my exams now, because it's got to help. It can't hurt. But again, it's just situational factors you might not realize affect your judgment. And I think I'm about done. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it a lot.